Here's an unfortunate accident, two of our planes.
You are watching extraordinary World War II color footage filmed or edited by Jack Lieb before and during D-Day. This is unlike anything you've seen. Using his personal 16mm Kodachrome camera, Lieb gives us a unique, intimate perspective. His journey takes the viewer from the D-Day preparations in England through the liberation of Paris and eventually into Germany. Along the way, he documented the lives of ordinary people in France, interspersed with glimpses of celebrities like Ernest Hemingway.
Here we see some pictures made by automatic cameras that were installed in the fighter planes, because when a pilot reported that he had shot down an enemy plane, he wasn't given credit unless his pictures proved that the plane was shot down. And these automatic cameras would operate in conjunction with his machine guns. And if you look closely, you'll see the pilot jump out of the plane in the shot. But you notice too that a lot of these planes are still carrying the extra fuel tanks that they were carrying underneath the wing. And whenever the bullets hit that tank, the plane would explode, as you will see here. But when you saw shots like this, you know that the pilot never got back. Of course, these heavy guns caused terrific concussion, and it was difficult to hold a handheld camera that long. One of the first things that the Americans did was to build an airstrip in the St. Mary Glees area, not far from the coast. And they used a strip that was supported by metal wire to keep the planes from sinking into the ground. And they were using it also as a place to take off from with 500-pound bombs under each wing. But the strip was so rough that frequently the bombs would break loose, and even though they were armed, they had to be disarmed and taken off the runway. These are P-47s that they were using here, and there's one carrying a bomb under each wing to attack the enemy deep in behind the lines. You notice these two planes taking off at once, raising considerable dust, but managing to get off a very short runway. And here you notice a plane, you notice the buckle under the wheels. This sometimes caused the mesh wire to break and come up and hit the plane's propeller, causing it to crash before it left the ground. One place that intrigued me was my first trip to London and the House of Parliament in Big Ben. Now, these pictures, you must remember, are more than a quarter of a century old. Now, the thing that amused and entertained our boys who were stationed all over England was Westminster Abbey. And there were quite a few Americans who came there to see the sights and see Westminster Abbey. And these are the scenes that I wanted to photograph on one Sunday afternoon. Another area that intrigued me was Marble Arch. Marble Arch on one Sunday afternoon was full of people. You must remember that London was being bombed almost every night in this particular time. And I was photographing these speakers that were addressing the crowds. Every speaker was speaking on a different subject, but the police stood around and watched, and as long as there were no arguments, any strong arguments, nobody was hurt. And the people in the audience were arguing back with the speakers. But these were just typical shots of how we passed the time waiting for D-Day. Most of the children who lived in England, or a great many I should say, were sent out of the city. But a lot of them had to remain behind. But in spite of a war, they managed to find entertainment. I was rather surprised to see these children drinking out of community drinking cups that were changed to the fountain. And I'd like to make candid shots of these children so they didn't notice me, but every once in a while they did. But this youngster is taking a cool drink on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. And we discovered that the St. Paul's Cathedral had been hit several times, but not badly damaged. And of course, one of the other attractions was Buckingham Palace and the gates, which were protected by British troops, not in the bearskin hats which they wore in peacetime, but in full war uniforms. And this is the way they paraded up and down. They weren't performing for the camera, but they were actually doing their duty. But you notice the barrage balloons in the background. London had barrage balloons all over the area. And it was said that if it wasn't for the barrage balloons, with all the equipment that was being brought into the country, that the islands would sink into the sea, but the barrage balloons, they said, was holding it up. You must remember, too, that food was pretty scarce in London at this time, and it was being brought in whatever way they could and being unloaded. But it isn't often you get a bright day like this in the spring in London, and this was an opportunity to show what the soldiers were doing while they were waiting for the invasion. This is Fleet Street. Discovered this Irish policeman guarding the street, and we saw considerable damage in the area. But soon, we were down on the south coast of England, where we met some of the other correspondents who were scheduled to cross the channel with us. And you'll probably recognize some of the old-timers who covered the war in that particular time. I was given a shovel to defend myself, and it proved to be a valuable instrument. And here we see Larry LeSueur of CBS. Larry LeSueur was covering the war for CBS, and so was Wertenbecker on the left, Jack Thompson of the Chicago Tribune, Ernie Pyle here, and this is a close-up of Jack Thompson, and this is O'Reilly, Larry O'Reilly of the Associated Press. This is Wertenbecker, and we're saying our farewells because we were expected to meet again in Paris. Here on the left we see Clark Lee of INS and Bill Stoneman, who came from Chicago, from the Daily News, and several other of the correspondents were being boarded aboard a military truck to be taken to the south coast. And we went through small British towns, and life was going on as usual. The people were in the marketplace buying food, and as though nothing was going on. But after a 150-mile ride, that's how we felt, riding in an Army vehicle. We found Plymouth was pretty badly damaged. A lot of the buildings were completely destroyed, but this was found all over the area. Soon we were approaching the dock area, and we found these American jeeps ready to be boarded aboard landing craft, and you notice the bars that are attached to their bumpers. And they're designed to cut wires that the Germans had a habit of putting across the road that would sometimes cut off the head of the drivers. We weren't allowed to wander around the area by ourselves. Each crossroad point was under guard of both an American and a British soldier. And if they wanted to see what you had in your bedroll, you had to show it to them. But this is the care that was taken that the secret of the invasion be kept as long as it could. These are the two men, Wes Carroll of the OWI and Pete Carroll and Wes Haynes, rather, who were with me, and we went aboard an LCI number 5. Pete Carroll here came from Boston, and he was a photographer for the Associated Press. And we tried to keep our mind off what was coming, and we knew it was going to be a short time before we would be on board. We had our first taste of K-rations, which didn't taste bad if you were hungry. And we also were able to see the beautiful countryside in that area. And these are the sort of shots I wanted to bring home to show my family and friends. Pete Carroll was using some of his film to make a few shots himself. And soon, we were down at the docks. And there we found units of the 101st Airborne Division carrying everything they could carry by hand, boarding landing craft that were so heavily laden they had to be pushed off the docks by trucks, as you see in this manner. And these men were being taken out to larger craft and boarded for the invasion. And here we see several units carrying grenades, bazookas. They didn't have an opportunity to load this aboard jeeps that were not fully available at this particular moment. We were aboard a fleet of LCIs, and here shown with the commander of the invasion group in the center, and the captain on the right, rather the captain of our ship, Lieutenant Patton, was in command of the LCI number 5, and we found out that he participated in several invasions in the Mediterranean area, and we felt rather confident that he knew what he was doing. But we stayed aboard this ship for almost 5 days. This is the commander of the squadron. I remember Lieutenant Patton's name well because we were with him for so long. Wes Haynes was trying to get ready for the trip into Paris. I think he was premature. And these are units of the 101st Airborne Division aboard our landing craft, amusing themselves. And I don't have to tell you who this man is imitating. He was a Notre Dame football player at one time, and I was told later on that he was killed in the action. Of course, every ship had a mascot, and ours was no different, but the boys provided for their mascot's welfare with the making of a life preserver, just like the ones that they wore themselves. And then one afternoon, Lieutenant Patton briefed the crew and told them that we would be sailing that afternoon. And they let out a cheer because this is the job they were waiting for. They wanted to get it done and go home. And here we see the LCI number 4 with the commander moving out into the channel. And this was a tremendous sight to see ships from one end of the horizon to the other. Ships of all kinds. They tell me there was well over 1,000 ships. But even so, we thought this was just another exercise. As we continued on, we felt that we'd be turned around, go back and try again another day. But when we continued on into the night, we knew it was the real thing. At one time, we had a bit of a scare. They said there was a submarine in the area, and one of the DE boats threw some bombs into the channel. And they exploded, but we never saw any attack at all. Here are some scenes actually taken close to the beach, where the ships made a right-angle turn and headed for the area where we were to land. That is a DE boat in the distance. And of course, we were on the alert for any kind of attack, even airplane attacks. Fortunately, our Air Force did their job well, and at no time did I know of a German attack, except after we had landed, 2 planes attempted to strafe the beach. And I happened to be in the area. Now, these are some scenes that I took with my camera that was reduced to 16 millimeter. This particular scene of these men going ashore was taken by an automatic camera aboard a British landing craft. And they were the first men to land. The reason it was taken by an automatic camera was because they wanted to have a record of what happened should the landing fail. At least they might have a record, if they were able to recover the film, of what happened and how to avoid it if they had to try another attack. But here are some scenes landing on the Utah beach, and this is the way we went ashore. This is, again, is at the British beach, but you notice the men didn't dash ashore after being aboard a landing craft for 5 solid days. They just walked slowly and cautiously, fearful of bombs and mines that were sown in the area. You notice they had their rifles wrapped in cellophane. But this is the way we had to go ashore. And I needn't tell you that a lot of the boys didn't make it. Here is Pete Carroll and Wes Haynes carrying our own equipment, and the ship is grounded on the beach. The section of the beach we were on was being attacked by enemy fire, and in the previous shot you could see a bomb actually land not too far from where we were. There it is again. And the bulldozers were trying to clear roads to let our jeeps and tanks move forward. And even though it was June, the area was quite cold, as it usually is in that part of Normandy. Of course, the men dug their foxholes a little deeper, and we had the good fortune of finding a concrete wall which helped serve as protection. But even now, we're taking some of our wounded back to the beach so they can be transferred back to England. But when the tide went out, the ships could not come in close, or those that went aground had to wait for tide to be refloated if they weren't hit. We stayed on the beach the first night and lived in a foxhole, and soon we showed some of the first prisoners taken in the area late the first day, who were captured close to the beach and were sent back to England because there was no room to keep them there. This is our first command post, where General Collins on the left is talking to some of his officers, and we were able to get some of the first hot food at this place, and I didn't realize how hungry I was until I saw these pictures. There's Larry LeSueur again and Bob Landry on the right. Bob Landry was covering the war for Time and Life. And although it kept me very busy for 8 solid days, I used up all the film I had and decided to go back to France to get some more and probably to get a bath. I hadn't had my clothes off during that entire time. And my landing at England took place at a place near Bournemouth. It almost looks like the cliffs of Dover that everyone is familiar with, but it was a beautiful sight to see the coast of England and know that I could get some rest after a while. But didn't realize it at that time that the buzz bombs would start coming over, and here we see some of them flying over the English coastline. And these buzz bombs were a terror weapon. They didn't know where they would land, but the British were quick to set up machine guns and anti-aircraft fire to knock them out of the sky, and they managed to shoot down quite a few. They even sent planes up into the sky to knock them out of the air. And of course, sometimes they did get through, and where they fell, they caused considerable damage. But you must have missed that pretty good shooting. There's one actually coming down, and it landed in the London area, and wherever they landed, they caused considerable damage. My second crossing of the Channel was made on an LST, and this time with units of the 3rd Armored Division that was sorely needed because they were bringing over more tanks and vehicles to carry us in the direction of Cherbourg, because we needed a port badly. The LST was manned by a British crew. That's the captain in the British uniform. But we were in a long convoy of many of them, everyone loaded to the gills with equipment that was sorely needed. But here you'll get an idea of what the beach looked like, and these ships are actually waiting for the tide to recede so they could send their equipment ashore without going through deep water. On D-Day, they had to go through the deep water. And at this particular moment, they're waiting for the ramps to be rebuilt after a severe storm so they could go ashore without damage. Now, you can see the problems they had on D-Day, because when the landing craft hit the sandbars, the men started wading ashore and found deeper water ahead, and those that had their life preservers too low around their waist turned turtle, and many were drowned. But these are units of the 3rd Army heading in, crossing the deep spot just ahead of them, and headed toward Cherbourg itself. This was a remarkable sight, and the ships were lined up as far as the eye could see, bringing supplies ashore. We needed Cherbourg badly because we thought we could use it as a port, but we found that Cherbourg, shown here, was pretty badly destroyed by the Germans themselves. They destroyed the docks, which we thought we could use, and it took them, if I recall, almost 2 months before we could bring a ship in. They set up mines and destroyed the famous Cherbourg docks where the transatlantic liners used to land. They not only destroyed the docks, but also the inland bridges that crossed the rivers that entered the Cherbourg area, the canals. This is one of them was destroyed by the Germans. Soon the French people came back into the city and gave us a warm welcome. And soon we found the prisoners, and I think they took something like 16 or 18,000 men out of the Cherbourg area, and they're still holding their personal belongings, marching toward the beaches because they had to be transported to England and some eventually to the States to be held in prisoner of war camps. And even at this time, those that could talk to us or would talk to us said we'd be pushed back into the Channel in less than a week. Of course, at every headquarters area, we found that the Germans had a picture of Herr Hitler, and our boys are using it as a pinboard. But the Americans had a way of amusing themselves. Now here is the first official ceremony held in France when General Collins on the right presented the tricolor flag made out of parachute cloth, seen here, to the mayor of Cherbourg, who was holding the microphone. And our boys of the 7th Corps were given clean uniforms for the occasion. And soon the people that came back to Cherbourg after the fighting stopped came to visit with us and talk to us. Here we see Ernie Pyle in the center again and talking to a colonel of the Signal Corps. And this is Bert Brandt, who we saw earlier shooting for AP. There's Cecil Carnes and John McGlinchey. And here is, oh gosh, 25 years has done a lot to my memory. But the troops began to move in the opposite direction to attack the enemy on the St. Lo line. And we were passing through the city of Valognes, and of course it was completely destroyed. I was there several times since the war, and it's been rebuilt beautifully. But the Germans tried to make a stand here, and wherever they did try to make a stand, we had to knock them out, and in so doing, destroyed the city. A little later on, I had an opportunity to see the construction that was built by slave labor. And all along the beach, especially in the Normandy area, as well as other areas, they built these triangles. Many of them had mines attached to them so that if a boat touched them, they would explode. And I was told after taking this walk that I should be very careful not to step where the ground is soft. This is a church in Barfleur. That was a pretty little town that the Germans evacuated because the commander liked the city so much, the little town so much, that he did want to see it destroyed and just actually withdrew rather than let it be destroyed. It was a little fishing village, and I had the good fortune of coming back several times because the hotel was still intact and serving very excellent French food. A little further down the coast, we found these fortifications built by slave labor, and even these metal fences just to keep us from landing in the area. And these heavy fortifications that were many feet thick, and these correspondents were looking it over. In some areas, the Germans saw to it that they were destroyed, blowing them up so that we couldn't use them against them if they tried to take them back. They even destroyed their own weapons, but we noticed that the walls and fortifications were very thick and very strong. The area was taken over by the Navy, and there was an observation post right on the end. This was near a town called Granville, and there is the lighthouse at the point that sort of separated Normandy from Brittany. And that's the observation post the Germans used, and it's under the command of our naval officers to use as an observation post. Soon we brought in some of our big armament. and they were set up in a field and firing at German positions. But even though the guns were firing, the French people were bringing in the crops as though nothing was happening. This surprised me, and I couldn't help but wanting to make a picture of it. Of course, these heavy guns caused terrific concussion, and it was difficult to hold a handheld camera that long. One of the first things that the Americans did was to build an airstrip in the St. Mary Glees area, not far from the coast. And they used a strip that was supported by metal wire to keep the planes from sinking into the ground. And they were using it also as a place to take off from with 500-pound bombs under each wing. But the strip was so rough that frequently the bombs would break loose, and even though they were armed, they had to be disarmed and taken off the runway. These are P-47s that they were using here, and there's one carrying a bomb under each wing to attack the enemy deep in behind the lines. You notice these two planes taking off at once, raising considerable dust, but managing to get off a very short runway. And here you notice a plane, you notice the buckle under the wheels. This sometimes caused the mesh wire to break and come up and hit the plane's propeller, causing it to crash before it left the ground. And here's an unfortunate accident, two of our planes. Here we see some pictures made by automatic cameras that were installed in the fighter planes, because when a pilot reported that he had shot down an enemy plane, he wasn't given credit unless his pictures proved that the plane was shot down. And these automatic cameras would operate in conjunction with his machine guns. And if you look closely, you'll see the pilot jump out of the plane in the shot. But you notice, too, that a lot of these planes are still carrying the extra fuel tanks that they were carrying underneath the wing. And whenever the bullets hit that tank, the plane would explode, as you will see here. But when you saw shots like this, you know that the pilot never got back. One of the highlights of our trip across France was Mont Saint-Michel. Mont Saint-Michel was on a river that separated Normandy from Brittany. And here we met some of the other correspondents. This is Bob Capper of Time magazine, and I know there's a member in the audience who knew Bob Capper. And Bob Capper was eventually killed. He was covering the war in Indochina when the French was fighting. But at Mont Saint-Michel, we found the Poulard Hotel, run by Madame Poulard. And the reason we liked the place is she served some delicious omelets for which she was famous. And that's Madame Poulard and a famous hotel in the background. And a lot of the correspondents gathered here to fight the war from this point because we were closer to the front line, if you could call it such, than we were at our main bases. And there we see the river that separates Normandy from Brittany. This is a beautiful little island, and the building at the top is a monastery that was still intact. It was not destroyed at all. And here are some of our GIs looking over the sights of the monastery, being shown around by a woman guide. Soon we met some of the other correspondents we knew, and here we see Charles Collingwood, the gentleman on the right, with Helen Kirkpatrick of the Chicago Daily News, and Joe Liebling of New Yorker magazine, the bald-headed chap, and Wertenbecker on the extreme left. Liebling wrote many stories for New Yorker magazine, and he died not many years ago. This is Charles Collingwood and Helen Kirkpatrick of the Chicago Daily News. This is Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway was covering for Collier's magazine, and we met him at Mont Saint-Michel. Here he is seen talking with Bill Walton, who incidentally became a fast friend of President Kennedy. And these were just moments that we could take a little time out to rest. There's Helen Kirkpatrick, and the man in the center in this picture is Bill Stringer, and he was killed trying to get into Paris. One of the things that correspondents tried to do was to get into Paris before anyone else, and he was hit by an 88 shell. But this is just a moment of relaxation. We had a few, and of course, these are the shots I wanted to bring home to the family and friends. But the little island was very quaint, and it was a very old place, but it was fortified in several ways. We discovered that the beaches in the area, especially when the tide was out, would be high and dry, and they put those sticks in the sand to keep our planes from landing. We found a little family of 3 brothers, and even the tall blonde one was a boy, I found out later, because their grandmother was taking care of them. Their parents, I was told, were killed at the Battle of St. Lo. One afternoon, rather late, I walked out behind the island because as the sun was setting, I could get some interesting shots of the island from the seaside, because they have an extremely high tide here and would leave the island high and dry, but the tide would come in real fast, and there was always danger of quicksand, so I didn't stand in one place too long. But the receding waters left this unusual design in the sand. We didn't stay at Mont Saint-Michel very long, but continued on deeper into France. In fact, I went into Brittany for a while and discovered that the boys had found a lake there, which we'll see in a moment. But the countryside was beautiful. It was during the summer, and the crops were still in the field. But our boys, after washing out of a helmet for many weeks, decided to use this beautiful lake for a bath. They were permitted to do so because they were fighting the enemy at an area called St. Malo. And incidentally, you probably recall the Germans held out at St. Malo for many months, almost to the end of the war. The American sense of humor that helped them win the war, too. But here are some of the correspondence that we sometimes travel together, and we found a little river that proved to be useful as a bath. There are a lot of these small rivers around France, and at every moment that we could spare, the correspondence, this is a group of them. That's Ralph Morse in the front, and Huey Broderick, and Joe Priestley, and of course here we see Edward G. Robinson. Edward G. Robinson was one of the many actors and actresses that came to Normandy to entertain our troops. And they held a show right in this Normandy barn that was not too far from the fighting. And I found out later that the intermission had to be called when the shells came too close. Of course, all you had to do was point a camera at Robinson, and he acted. Soon we found ourselves in Rambouillet. Rambouillet was 52 kilometers from Paris and was the headquarters for all the correspondents that came there. We see Ernie Pyle again on the left, and George Stevens, the Hollywood director, myself, and of course Pete Carroll. It was shortly after these pictures were taken that Ernie Pyle decided to return back to the States and then went to the Pacific, where he was killed. George Stevens was a very well-known Hollywood director, I'm sure you recall, and he died only a few years ago. But practically every correspondent turned out to try to get into the city of Paris. But we found, as I said earlier, that the General Eisenhower had given permission to the 2nd French Armored Division to take the city of Paris, because the important thing was to destroy the enemy. And they didn't consider Paris as a target. It would delay them if they did try to take the city themselves. They wanted to circumvent the city because they wanted to give the honor to the French. General Leclerc was in command of the 2nd Armored Division, and he refused to let the correspondents accompany his force to get into the city, simply because he didn't want any shots made until he had the city secure. We were glad to see Paris because it was a city of great beauty, and we were amazed at the way the people turned out. And these are some of the shots taken on the first day of liberation. I just didn't nearly get enough of these shots because there was too much to do. And soon General de Gaulle came into the city and paraded down the Champs-Élysées. And here he is taking the salute and receiving some flowers from a French girl. It must be remembered that de Gaulle was not well known at this time, and very few people could listen to the radio reports that told about his work in England prior to crossing the Channel. But soon he became very popular. It seemed as though everybody in Paris turned out to see de Gaulle. And he was marching down the Champs-Élysées at this point, and it was a tremendous sight to see. Later in the day, our own troops paraded down the avenue, and this was something that made us all proud. And here's de Gaulle parading, and suddenly firing opened up from forces that were left behind, and they thought from the FFE and some of the fascists that were still in the city trying to panic the people. But if you stuck your head out a window, you were bound to lose it. And this went on continuously for several hours. In fact, I was in the middle of this thing, and these are shots that I took of people lying flat on the ground. They'd get under our car. We couldn't move the car while they were trying to get the people to stop shooting by raising white flags. But it went on continuously, and although it was small arm fire, de Gaulle just stood his ground. Mother wasn't taking any chances. But this is the way the streets of Paris looked on the day of liberation. They did catch some of these people who were responsible for the shooting. At least they told us that. Somehow it was the war of nerves. Some of the buildings still contained Germans that were at headquarter points, and they were sworn at by the French. These are some shots made late in the day of the American troops marching through the streets of the city on the way to the front lines. Wherever we stopped, the French were there to trade champagne for cigarettes and to talk to us and find out what was going on. We were able to see the city. It wasn't badly destroyed. There was some small arms fire. The lion lost his tail, but generally speaking, all the bridges were intact over the city, and this is the Opera House. And since it was my first trip to Paris, I enjoyed seeing the beautiful city of Paris. Soon the people of Paris were out parading again along the Champs-Élysées with their newfound liberty. We discovered that the Eiffel Tower, which was reported destroyed and used for arms, was still intact. And soon I managed to get permission to go up into the Eiffel Tower and see what it looked like from up above. But there was much to be done, and even though Paris looked beautiful, conditions were very poor. The railroads were practically destroyed. There was no way of bringing in food. In fact, when we were coming down the road, we saw large trucks waiting to get into the city, loaded with all kinds of foodstuffs to support the city, which was in dire need not only of food, but of coal, because at this time it was getting pretty cold. It was late in the year, and there was no way of getting supplies in. These are scenes from the Eiffel Tower showing the Seine and the buildings close to the Eiffel Tower. We see some troops parading through the streets. But we had to move on, and soon I had to leave Paris and found myself in the countryside beyond Paris and went into Belgium, where I managed to get into Brussels. These are some scenes of the Auteuil racetrack, which we found was open shortly after the liberation. This surprised everyone, but they made them close the track after a few days of meeting. But one of the things that did surprise everyone is how well dressed the French women were, and they had a way of using whatever they had to make themselves look really attractive. And I understand this annoyed some of the other Allied countries very much, to think that they could get by like that. They even opened up the art galleries along the streets, and we didn't know whether they were permitted to do this prior to our getting there, but they certainly opened up for business very shortly after we arrived. We found a painter at work in the old quarter of Paris, and shortly after leaving Paris, I was in an area called the Ardennes. And the reason I took some of these shots of the countryside, because the weather was turning cold and the trees were turning their fall colors. And this is the town of Houffalize, which was completely destroyed on the breakthrough that occurred and the attack on Bastogne. I was in Bastogne just a few days before the breakthrough and was fortunate enough to get out of there, not knowing about the attack, but I did think that this was a place that the enemy could hide troops, and they did. That's General Collins again, talking to General Morris Rose, who was in command of the 3rd Armor Division. This is General Rose on the left. General Rose was killed in Cologne. It was an unfortunate happening because they thought they had the place protected, but there were some enemy troops in the area, and he was shot. These are units of the 3rd Armor Division that were fighting the enemy, and we managed to get some shots of them as they were being entertained by German children. We had a tremendous reception all the way across France, but when we got to Germany, the reception was not there. All the homes in the German area had white flags in front of them as an indication, of course, of surrender. And the children here were actually on their way to school, and children everywhere look cute, and they're holding their ears because our guns are firing not far away, and they were just trying to avoid the noise. We found the Siegfried Line, as it was called, or the Dragon's Teeth, which were built again by slave labor, I'm told, and they were not a fortification against our tanks because our bulldozers took dirt and pushed it over the top of them and rode right over the top. But we found these fortifications stretched out from one end of Germany to the other, because somehow they felt that we'd perhaps get to Germany, and they were trying to keep us out, but they didn't succeed, of course. The war was moving rather rapidly at some points in Germany, and soon I found myself in the town of Aachen. Aachen was under fire when these pictures were taken. That's the reason the scenes are devoid of people. There were mortar shells passing over our heads all the time, and the enemy was holding the center of the city as we were making these shots, and we were just wondering how long the battle would take, and we discovered that the troops were just down behind that mold or that wreckage in the distance, and soon we discovered that these reserves were just a block or two behind the front line, and they were waiting to be called in. I was told later on that the captain you saw in the picture a moment ago, somebody in the audience knew him and said he was killed in the action that took place shortly after that. Well, after Aachen, I was invited to fly home, and this is something I was glad to be able to do, because here we see some of the cemeteries that were built on the Normandy beaches, above the beaches, and these are scenes of Berlin showing the tremendous damage that occurred in the city. The bombings were intense, and very little of Berlin was left standing. It shows that wars don't seem to prove very much, except to destroy property and kill people. And we sometimes think that maybe one day we'll learn how to avoid wars, and perhaps we've made wars so deadly that we'll have to avoid them in the long run to stay alive. Soon I was able to photograph some of the events when General Eisenhower came back to the States and was greeted in Kansas City. These shots were made with a telephoto lens at quite a distance. Then I was able to visit the collection of some of the weapons the Germans used just after the invasion. This is the V-2 rocket that followed the V-1s. The V-1s were a terror weapon, and the V-2s were certainly the same, but that was the first time they used rockets, and they were able to shoot them great distances. The V-1s, and I heard many of them come overhead, were like a motorcycle engine, and whenever the motor stopped, it would cause the bomb to drop. The Germans had jet planes in the air before the war ended. And here is one that they actually used, and it showed a record of many American planes, and if you notice, 42 Russians were shot down by this plane before it was captured by our side. And in this exhibit, we see one of the Japanese kamikaze bombs that was on exhibition, and one of our pilots is trying it for size. And they didn't like the idea that you only had a one-way ticket, because they were intended to destroy the target they were after and the pilot with it. This plane, I was told, was built by the enemy to bomb New York, and it could fly the ocean and back, and they appropriately named it Alles Kaputt. Here we see some shots of what I call what the next war might look like, and this is the explosion of the atomic bomb in New Mexico. And I always like to feel when I show these pictures that perhaps it'll remind people that we ought to remember what World War II was like, and that World War III would be much worse. But I like to say that, repeat what one scientist aptly put it when he said, the atomic bomb is here to stay. The question is, are we? And that brings us to the end of our film, and thank you very much.
What caused an air force that was in many ways vastly superior to the Allies to come crashing down? Is there a distinct turning point that made Germany's aerial arsenal impotent against the combined strength of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union? For the first time ever, put yourself right in the middle of the debate as we try to solve the greatest arguments in the history of aviation. What caused the Luftwaffe to fail? In 1933, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany and later the Führer, enacting complete control over the fatherland. Eager to reclaim the lost territories taken from Germany after the Treaty of Versailles, the Nazi war machine realizes early on that the formation of a strong air force is vital. In 1935, it becomes official on paper, and the Luftwaffe is born. The man put in charge of this department is Hermann Göring, a prominent ace from the Great War.
Goering was a World War I fighter pilot. He was not interested in technology. He said something at one point, he said, well, this device is a box with coils, and I don't like boxes with coils. He's still had this sort of, well, if you're courageous and brave, you don't have to worry about technological gizmos.
In building this new air force, the Nazis possess many advantages that other nations do not, including a first-class aircraft industry, symbolized by the names Messerschmitt, Dornier, Heinkel, Junkers, and Focke-Wulf. Brilliant engineers capable of taking aerodynamics to a whole new level, and a highly educated population that can build aircraft on a mass scale. By 1938, production rises to over 5,000 planes. 1 year later, that figure soars to over 8,000, a testament to the importance Nazis place on the doctrine of air power.
What the Germans were trying to do was to employ new machines, new technologies, but to employ them in the service of a very, very old way of war that had served them well in previous conflicts and they felt would continue to serve them well in the future. I think this sets the Germans somewhat apart from neighboring countries in the 1920s and 1930s in that They are not truly looking ahead as much as they are looking back to their old traditions and grafting new technologies onto them.
Before war is declared in August of 1939, Germany's aerial arsenal is impressive to say the least. Ready to go is the Me-109, a superior single-engine fighter, the Junkers 87 Stuka, a terrifying dive bomber, the Heinkel 111 and the Dornier 17 Flying Pencil, two top-of-the-line medium-range bombers. This, in addition to the largest air transport industry in the entire world, exemplified by the Junkers 52, a workhorse that will be at the centerpiece of the German offensive. Even with all these phenomenal aircraft, a key ingredient is missing, as is often noted by Second World War historians: the absence of strategic bombers. This void does not go unnoticed in 1935, when General Walter Wever, realizing their importance, enthusiastically supports the building of long-range aircraft to battle any potential enemy, most likely the Soviet Union.
General Walter Wever was promoting what he called the Urals bomber. He believed that the industrialization, tanks, planes, etc., that was going on in the Urals area had to be demolished if you were going to win a war against Russia.
Wever writes, "Air power carries the war right into the heart of enemy country from the moment war breaks out. It strikes at the very root of the enemy's fighting power and of the people's will to resist."
Yeah, Walter Wever was very much in favor of this long-distance bomber to try and bomb Russia. And that actual project was given the name of the Ural bomber. Wever actually then put specifications out to both Dornier and Junkers for the building of this long-range bomber. Out of this came the Dornier 19 and the Junkers 89. But neither of these aircraft had the performance that was currently available in the United States of the B-17 Flying Fortress. So therefore, neither of those airplanes really progressed very far beyond a couple of prototypes.
Dying due to a plane crash in 1936, his doctrine epitomized by the Dornier 19 and the Junkers 89 are scrapped by Goering.
Goering, I think, didn't go along with this because he rather took the view that Hitler had, that they could win by blitzkrieg, and they wouldn't be required to get into this lengthy process of using heavy bombers.
Inquiring as to how many twin-engine planes can be made for every four-engine one, the answer given to him is 2.5. The Field Marshal's response is that the Führer does not ask me how big my bombers are, but how many there are. It is important to note that the decision not to build long-range bombers cannot be considered a failure. For Germany, the raw materials needed to build such planes would require large amounts of rubber, metals, and fuel, all of which would have to be imported for a hefty price. Of the 4,500 tons of aluminium needed per month for aircraft production, only half is available during the Wever era. The Air Force that he and others envisioned was simply uneconomic at the time. What truly represented the German way of war is instead a tactical Air Force.
The German war of movement attempted to defeat as much of the enemy army as possible within the opening weeks of fighting. So the tactical level of fighting for an individual position, and then the operational level of attempting to defeat an enemy army. But arguably, Germany had never been very good, and this would go back to Prussia before it, at the kind of long-term strategic planning that the Allies were so skilled at in World War II. Arguably, this was because the Germans felt they had to win all their wars quickly or they would not win them at all, and that attempting to play strategic warfare with the vast economic and industrial resources of the United States was a losing game from the start.
Working closely with those on the ground, the Luftwaffe is wildly successful as the Second World War begins. Poland is easily demolished. Norway is taken away from the British effortlessly. The Low Countries and even the power of France cannot resist German might during the year 1940. It appears that nothing can stop Nazi forces from gobbling up the continent of Europe.
Certainly the Luftwaffe played an extremely important part in the opening German victories of World War II. And when we say opening victories, we don't mean the first 6 months, we mean the first 2 years, in which it looked like a German victory was very much in the offing. The German Air Force was very skilled at the tactical level, that is cooperation with the ground forces. It was extremely successful at the operational level of war, the intermediate level, that is carrying out campaigns against enemy supply lines, for example, feeding troops and men to the front.
With the fall of France, Britain is the only nation standing in the way of this German juggernaut. In order to finish off the rebellious island nation, a plan known as Operation Sea Lion is approved. It calls for the Luftwaffe to achieve air superiority over the English Channel. Once this is completed, German forces will be deployed onto British soil. However, during this pivotal battle, the Luftwaffe is dealt its very first aerial defeat. Primarily through the use of Spitfires and Hurricanes, the English are able to push back German planes from the coast of Britannia. While this monumental struggle ensues, we discover one of the Luftwaffe's greatest failure, its lack of coordination with the Kriegsmarine.
Goering said, "Everything that flies is mine," and bitterly fought against any attempts by the German Navy to get a hold of a piece of the air action. When they wanted long-range aircraft assigned to them, Goering, actually, Dönitz went behind Goering's back directly to Hitler, and I think got a dozen of the Focke-Wulf Condors assigned to him. Goering, when he found out about this, was furious and actually cut off all cooperation with the Kriegsmarine at this point.
Despite pleas by Admiral Raeder to create a separate air force for the Navy, Goering refuses to give the green light to any potential inter-service rival. The roots for this conflict come from each service's desire to be recognized as the one who brought victory to the fatherland.
Of course, there has always been the rivalry between the Navy and the Air Force from the point of view that we refer to ourselves as the Imperial Navy and refer to the Air Force as the Nazi Air Force. So that differentiated us already in attitude and character.
In hindsight, Goering's decision proves fatal as Germany and Britain battle it out in both the skies and on the high seas. Winston Churchill would write that the greatest threat to Britain was the Battle of the Atlantic, where German U-boat submarines are enormously successful in sinking English shipping.
I think Churchill was quite correct that the Battle of the Atlantic was the one front where Britain could really lose the war because they were so dependent on supplies, even food, coming from North America, that if that lifeline was cut, Britain would have been really in dire straits.
With the defeat of France, bases are built right on their coast, giving these vessels an even bigger theatre to disrupt the lifeline of Britain. Had aerial forces worked closely with these U-boats, or if a separate naval aviation wing was created, it would be a game-changer in Germany's war against Britain. Proof of this can be seen in the Focke-Wulf 200 Condor, an aircraft that, despite its limitations, is excellent in attacking English ships. With no more than a dozen planes, they successfully sink 85 merchant vessels and over 300,000 tons of shipping.
When the Germans started to deploy a fairly small number of the Focke-Wulf 200 Condors to attack Allied shipping, they were able to have really a devastating effect.
Also, had the new invention of a magnetic mine been dropped by Luftwaffe planes into the English Channel, its enemy could have been starved out of the war. This marks the first major failure of the Luftwaffe.
It was our common complaint of us, the little people, let's say, that there was no coordination whatsoever between the German Navy and the German Air Force.
With a stalemate on the Western Front, Germany decides to keep the British at bay and instead focus attention on their ally, the Soviet Union. Enacting a war plan known as Operation Barbarossa, some 3 million Nazi soldiers equipped with rifles, tanks, and planes begin the biggest land assault in history. Using less than 3,000 aircraft, a force smaller than that utilized in the battle against France, Germany is miraculously able to push back Soviet forces to the suburbs of Moscow. The decision to launch Operation Barbarossa exposes the Luftwaffe to its second major failure: the lack of maintenance and repair on the ground. When a German aircraft is damaged, it is sent back to the fatherland for repair. When fighting a relatively short and tactical war against France, this particular system works fairly well. When fighting a long, drawn-out war of attrition against the communists, however, it proves to be a gigantic blunder. In the Soviet Union, with the fighting taking place far away from the major cities of Germany, the time it takes engineers to repair a damaged aircraft and have it sent back to the front is enormous. And by 1941, less than 30% of the Luftwaffe's airfields are operational, a fact that is almost inconceivable when taken into account that Germany is fighting a two-front struggle. As Field Marshal Erhard Milch would reflect after the war, the vertical organization in 4 territorial determined Luftflotte commands was grossly inadequate for launching a war well beyond the borders of the Third Reich. The attack of June 22, 1941 would in retrospect be a catastrophic mistake. For those like Goering, men who had never fought on the Eastern Front during the First World War, they would grossly underestimate the Soviet will and the industrial capacity of a regime thought to be so backwards by Hitler. Moving its factories far beyond the Ural Mountains, they are out of range of German bombers. The ghost of General Weber comes back to haunt the Luftwaffe. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Germany declares war against the United States. Before this decision is made, Hitler shrugs off any suggestion of a possible American threat in the form of an arsenal of democracy. In declaring war, Hitler foolishly adds yet another enemy to the Third Reich's list, one with a production capacity that is unparalleled. With 2 oceans separating America from the fighting, its people can go on producing without the threat of bombardment. Britain would have hauled the flag down long ago if it had not been for America's support, one field marshal said. With Germany by this time experiencing severe shortage of aluminium and copper, America is fully stocked of these and other vital raw materials. By 1944, the United States is able to churn out over 96,000 planes per year, 1 every 5 minutes, more than double that of the Germans. Before this catastrophic decision is made, it is important to note that by 1940, even Britain, with its shipping being torpedoed at an unprecedented rate, is outproducing Germany in aircraft. The British are able to improvise, and as a result produce outstanding planes like the de Havilland Mosquito, an aircraft made from plywood. In contrast, by 1941, with Nazi forces engaged in a two-front war, total production is just over 11,000 planes, a yearly increase of only 3,000 from when the war began. It is clear that the Third Reich's total output is only a fraction of what it could be.
One of the failures of the German Luftwaffe was their inability ever to work out a sane procurement and production process. Prototypes would be built and abandoned. They would be rebuilt and altered by Hitler's order and abandoned, and rebuilt a third time and perhaps put into production as an aircraft very, very different from what the original designers had intended.
This lack of planning and foresight can be attributed to the man who took control of Luftwaffe production in 1936, long before the war began. His name is Ernst Udet. An outstanding ace from the First World War, he is put in control by Goering, replacing Wilhelm Wimmer. His appointment to this powerful position marks the third, and possibly the greatest failure of the Luftwaffe.
Goering placed one of his World War I fighter ace buddies, Ernst Udet, in charge of technical developments. Udet really didn't know anything about this stuff.
Udet's forerunner Wimmer has been outstanding in overseeing the Luftwaffe's second-generation aircraft during the pre-war era, including the Me-109, the Junkers 87, and the Heinkel 111. With Udet as his replacement, however, the next line of aircraft is a far cry from their predecessors.
one of his hobby horses was dive bombers. He had seen, actually, in America, interestingly, between the wars, a demonstration of dive bombing, thought every German bomber should be made into a dive bomber, and then even ordered this new four-engine bomber, Heinkel 177, under development, to be made into a dive bomber. Well, Heinkel himself, who was, after all, an engineer who understood this, kept trying to talk him out of it, said this is ridiculous, but was overruled, and so they had to go back and strengthen the wings of the 177 to try to reduce drag so it could actually dive at high speeds. They tried mounting the engines in pairs instead of having four engines like you would normally think you would do on a bomber. They were mounted front and back in a single pod on each wing. This resulted in so much heat being generated that the engines were constantly overheating. So it really, I mean, it was a crazy idea, and it led directly to delays, and I guess you can really say the ultimate failure of Germany to field an effective four-engine bomber during the war.
The Heinkel 177, with its odd tandem engine arrangement and an insane requirement by Udet to dive bomb, makes this plane a complete disaster from start to finish. The aircraft becomes known as the dead racehorse, with only a handful ever getting the chance to fly.
The Heinkel 177 and the Me-210 go hand in hand as one of the Luftwaffe's major disasters.
The Messerschmitt 210, a replacement for the Me-110, is full of problems that are never ratified.
When he came up with his Messerschmitt 210, the RLF said, oh yes, that's very good, let's immediately, we'll order 10,000. Or whatever it was, but they went into mass production and the thing had hardly flown. It was a complete and utter disaster for Messerschmitt, which he'd never lived down, and they had to convert a lot of the built Me-210s into Me-410s by taking the aeroplanes to pieces again and reassembling them with new parts to turn it into a flyable and operational machine.
As one aircraft representative is overheard saying, everything turns to dust in Udet's hands. Only one aircraft, the Focke-Wulf 190, is considered a success under his watch. A reluctance to make the hard decisions also proves costly, as resources are diverted to projects that are simply unfeasible during wartime. By 1941, the need is for long-range strategic bombers, with America producing the B-17 Flying Fortress and the British reworking the Avro Manchester into the four-engine Avro Lancaster. Germany, in contrast, falls dramatically behind the Allies in producing four-engine bombers. Udet, with all his failures, commits suicide in 1941, leaving the Luftwaffe in shambles. With a Soviet victory at Stalingrad, German forces are pushed back, marking the beginning of the end. And as American and British bombers begin destroying German factories and city centers from the sky, the philosophy that General Weber endorsed years ago is coming true. Strategic bombing is proving vital in weakening the German war machine. Under the command of Field Marshal Erhard Milch, production is able to climb to 25,000 planes a year, a respectable increase, but nothing compared to what the Allies are able to produce.
U.S. procurement policies, which become a giant bureaucracy, embodied in the War Department and soon thereafter, World War II, embodied in the Pentagon. The Germans were simply not able to compete on that level.
In 1944, Germany is being outmaneuvered in the realm of aircraft by the rate of over 4 to 1. At this point, there is simply no way to compete with the United States or the Soviet Union. While much is written by historians about Allied coordination in resources and materials, little can be found about Germany's willingness to use its own allies' means of production to their advantage. This is yet another failure of the German Luftwaffe. Without a common goal and being on different sides of the world, the Empire of Japan cannot be considered Germany's biggest ally. Its most powerful friend during the war is instead the Italians. Unfortunately, with their own air force in shambles, the Nazis are reluctant to give them the licenses and the engines to build German planes on Italian soil. This proves to be a pivotal mistake, as Italy could have tripled aircraft production with German assistance, producing possibly 30,000 planes during the war. Also, Italian factories would have been out of bombing range for the Allies during the year 1942 and might have changed the outcome in the Mediterranean. Germany's other allies, Romania, Hungary and Finland, are all capable of making aircraft, but lack the knowledge and resources that the fatherland can provide. Had these nations been granted licenses to build Nazi aircraft on their own soil, there was a good chance that this coalition might have tipped the scale in favor of Germany during its pivotal battle against the Soviets during 1941. The decision not to fully utilize the resources of these nations can be attributed to Germany's desire to be the dominant power. There is widespread resentment against the Italians by top Nazi leaders who see them as merely riding off the coattails of German success.
Our feeling always was, with the experience of the First World War already, we wish the Italians were on the other side.
People like Hermann Goering see these smaller countries as the providers of natural resources, with the fatherland supplying the finished products. This marks another tragic failure of the Luftwaffe. In early 1944, Germany unveils the Messerschmitt 262, a revolutionary jet plane that can hopefully take down the flying fortresses and mosquitoes that are destroying their cities.
Later on, of course, they produced the world's first production model, general use jet aircraft in the form of the Messerschmitt 262, the Me-262. The Me-262 as a pure fighter was an amazing sight to see, and in fact, anyone looking at it today is still struck by the modern and sleek lines.
Now, the Me-262 was, in my opinion, I've stated this many times, the most formidable aircraft of World War II.
The Me-262 is years ahead of its time, symbolizing the fatherland's creativity and innovation. In many ways, however, the Me-262 also symbolizes Nazi indecision.
Unfortunately, the Me-262 got caught in a very, very arcane and difficult procurement process within Germany, wherein basic designs were put forward by competent engineers. They were then changed by upper echelons within the Luftwaffe, and of course they had to pass the Hitler test. And no aircraft passed the Hitler test without being significantly modified. The Me-262 is no exception.
After Professor Messerschmitt tells Hitler that the aircraft can carry up to 1,000 kilograms of bombs, Field Marshal Milch, in a fit of rage, tells the Führer that even the smallest infant can see that the 262 is a fighter, not a bomber. After months of wavering, the plane goes ahead as a fighter-bomber, taking the sting out of what could have been a ferocious punch. They may possess this wonder weapon, but have few men that can fly it. This becomes the Luftwaffe's final failure, its pilots' lack of training. During its heyday, Germany's finest were given approximately 250 hours of flight time before being sent out to face their enemy, considerably more than the British. And with the Second World War going exceedingly well during 1940 and 1941, the Luftwaffe arrogantly minimizes its training program, figuring that the war will soon be over. By 1942, as the tide begins turning, German pilots are given less than 200 hours of practice flying, while Allied pilots are given over 300. With the war turning against them, shortcuts are made to churn out every single pilot possible. Despite this augmentation, by 1944 the average training time drops to just under 100 hours. In some cases, just a quarter of what P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt pilots were given. With air superiority lost over German soil, it becomes a turkey shoot for American and British aviators as they begin gunning down Me-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s with ease.
At D-Day, in the final planning, the head of Allied Tactical Aviation was asked, well, what are we going to do about the German fighters? He said there aren't going to be any German fighters over the landing beaches. And he was essentially right, because they'd been wiped out by that.
The decision not to build a pilot training infrastructure like its enemies causes the Luftwaffe to run desperately short on experienced men. So by the time planes like the ME-262, the Arado 234 jet bomber, the ME-163, a rocket-powered interceptor, the Dornier 335 Arrow, the fastest piston engine plane of the Second World War, and all the other revolutionary aircraft that could have been the difference maker on both fronts, it is a case of too little, too late. The defeat of the Luftwaffe can be attributed to its lack of direction. With the war going in Germany's favor, Hitler, Goering, and Udet were blinded by a false optimism. The tactical war doctrine that they favored initially was being replaced by a long, drawn-out strategic war that they were ill-prepared for. The arrogant nature in which they brushed off the industrial power of the United States and the Soviet Union. The mismanagement of their own country's aircraft industry on a grand scale, and the lack of infrastructure, production, and training during the Second World War's most decisive years would cause the Luftwaffe to write its own epitaph.
Well, the Messerschmitt 262, in my opinion, was the most formidable fighter of World War II. They had the advantage of, when they designed this, of supersonic wind tunnels. That is clearly shown in the fuselage shape of the 262. They were also well aware of the advantages of sweepback in easing your way through the transonic speed area. The aircraft was designed with these things in mind. So it was going to be a jump ahead of its time, so to speak. When I first saw it, I realized that this was a very different looking airplane. But also, at that time, I hadn't fully realized just the impact its engines were going to have, because we, in the early jet stages in Britain, were using engines operating on the centrifugal principle of jet propulsion. The Germans started off in that area as well, but they had a sector that went onto axial flow. And of course, today, every jet engine is axial flow. They were on the right track right away. But having said that they're on the right track, I must divert for a minute, because was it the right track at that time? I worked closely with Frank Whittle, who was invented or developed the jet engine. And I knew he knew all about the axial flow engine. I said to him, Frank, why have we gone centrifugal when the Germans are going axial? And he said, because in the early stages of jet propulsion, I want to give our Air Force an engine that is simple and reliable. Now, how right he was, because in the early stages, the German jet engines, whereas Frank Whittle's centrifugal engine had an overhaul life of 100 hours, you overhauled it, the German axial flow jet engines had a scrap life of 25 hours because they didn't have the strategic metals to withstand the heat stresses at that time. So, temporarily, we were on the right track. But eventually, of course, the axial flow offered advantages in streamlining, because for a given power, you had smaller compressor and turbine discs. And also, of course, it had better specific fuel consumption. And altogether, they were on the right track there. But unfortunately, they couldn't go to the ultimate because, as I said, they hadn't the right metals. However, as an airplane, this was something quite electrifying to fly. The cockpit, there was nothing particularly unusual. It wasn't a cluttered cockpit. It was quite simple, and it had the the functional things here, and the engine instruments on the right, and generally good view, good canopy view, and being a tricycle, you had a good view ahead. So altogether, they had a lot going for it, apart from this unreliability of the engines. Even when they were in the air, they were very sensitive to throttle movement. Excessive movement, either accelerating or decelerating, could flame out the engines. And it got so bad, in fact, that eventually the way the Germans were operating was to take off at full power, then ease slowly back to climbing power, and never touch the engines thereafter until you were coming into land. They took that risk, and this didn't pay off, I don't think, because, as I say, although it has a scrap life of, theoretically, of 25 hours, but Adolf Galland told me at the end of the war that his unit, flying the 262 JG-44 at the end of the war, was only having an engine life average of 12.5 hours. So it goes to show what the vulnerability of that was. Firepower on this airplane, huge. 4 30mm cannon. They had forgotten one thing, and we did the same with our initial jet, experimental jet aircraft. They had forgotten how to slow it down. They did not have dive brakes. And this cost them a little because the aircraft was built mainly to deal with the B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. And when you came in on a dive to attack them, your closing speed was huge. And you couldn't open fire because of the inaccuracy of the guns above 600 yards. So let's say you opened fire at 600, you had 2 seconds before you had to break away because your closing speed was so high. If they'd had dive brakes, that could have doubled the closing speed. Now with a closing speed of 2 seconds, you're firing at random. You're not sighting, you're just pressing the button and hoping you're pointing in the right direction. With 4 seconds, you can quickly sight, adjust and fire. So it made a big difference. Now the ME-262 was, in my opinion, I've stated this many times, the most formidable aircraft of World War II. When you consider that at the end of the war, the top Allied fighter was the Spitfire Mark 14 with a top speed of 446 miles an hour. When we tested the Messerschmitt 262, it had a top speed of 568 miles an hour. This was a quantum jump in performance, and it meant the 262 was virtually inviolate. It also handled quite well in the air. It had no nasty characteristics really, except if you lost an engine on takeoff before you reached safety speed. But apart from that, I was very impressed. It had 2 shortcomings, but all the early jets did in our country, in America and in Germany. Firstly, the engines were very sensitive. They were slow to accelerate to throttle movement, and you had to handle them very carefully to avoid flaming them out. Secondly, we hadn't thought, or the designers hadn't thought, of how to slow down these incredibly fast airplanes, and no air brakes were fitted. And this made life very difficult, for example, for landing. You need some drag if you're going to land. And since there was very little drag associated with the 262, you had to do a long, slow approach to landing. And this was an Achilles heel, because the 8th USAF Mustangs realized this, and the few 262s they picked off was usually in that phase of the operation. Of the 3 great airplanes I think the Germans produced in the war, I would say the Ju-88, the Focke-Wulf 190, and the Me-262 were the 3. The Ju-88, in my opinion, was a first-class medium bomber. The Ju-88 G4, for example, had a top speed of 400 miles an hour, which was 6 miles an hour faster than the 190 PA-4 at that time, its contemporary fighter. So it was a formidable airplane. And also the Germans had learned from the mistakes of the previous medium bomber, the Heinkel 111, where you had the crew separated by the bomb bay. You had the flying crew up to the front and the defensive crew at the back. But there could be a breakdown in communication. And also, there could be a breakdown in morale if you have the two separated. They had learned to put the 4 crew of the Ju-88 into one glass house, I think you would call it, on the fuselage. And the crews themselves were very enthusiastic about the airplane. I flew it quite a lot, that and the 188. The 188 had a rather different rudder effect, and I would say it had improved slightly over the Ju-88, but a negligible amount. It still had the good flying characteristics of the 88. In fact, slightly better. And I was very impressed with both types of aircraft. The Focke-Wulf 190, as a fighter, was first class. There's no question of that. It was an outstanding airplane. And inevitably, as the war progressed, there were attempts made to keep up with the hunt, so to speak, and give it a variety of roles. And there were many different marks of 190, and it eventually gravitated into the fighter bomber. In that role, it was quite effective, actually. Fighter bombers have a limited role. They are used against what I call targets of opportunity. You don't use them to come in and bomb an industrial layout. What you do is you use them to shoot up trains or convoys you see on the road. And from this way, the Focke-Wulf 190 was very effective again. So it was a versatile aircraft. And as it progressed, it eventually had an engine change. The Dora, the later Dora, was a magnificent fighter with an engine change and not really any structural changes other than those to accommodate the engine. But what it meant was, here was an airplane that could keep up with the hunt as the years of the war progressed. So from 1942 right up to the end of the war, the Focke-Wulf 190 was in the top grade of fighter or fighter bomber.
The The next series of films highlights the development and testing of the Me-163B. The B model was the ultimate version of the Me-163 line. This was the actual combat version of the aircraft. The vast majority of Me-163B flights were for development purposes, however, although the aircraft did finally see limited combat experience beginning in the middle of 1944. You'll note that there are significant shape differences between the Me-163B and the earlier A model and the DFS-194. The landing gear is substantially more robust on the B model than it was on the earlier A model. Here we can see a couple of ground crew members wrestling the jettisonable takeoff gear into place. We can also see the extensible landing gear as well. The Me-163B was a much larger aircraft than the earlier A model, where a pilot could easily just flop over the side of the canopy sill on the A model. A ladder was required for access to the cockpit on the B model. As the canopy closes, we can see an air vent at the leading edge of the canopy. You'll note also that the canopy is hinged to the side on the B model, whereas on the A model it was hinged to the rear. Here we see the servicing cart for the turbine being rolled away from the aircraft. There was a turbine inside the Me-163B which drove the fuel pumps for the T-stuff and C-stuff propellants that powered the Walter rocket motor. We can catch glimpses of the extensible tail wheel at the aft end of the Me-163B in some of these shots. This has changed from a tail skid on the A model. On the early B models, this tail wheel was unfaired. In some of the later B models that we will see later in this film, a fairing is constructed around that tail wheel to improve aerodynamic efficiency. As with the earlier members of the Me-163 family, including the DFS-194, climb performance for the B model was simply outstanding. Again, the aircraft was capable of climbing from a standing start to roughly 40,000 feet in 3 to 3.5 minutes. While the aircraft's performance was remarkable, this performance has to be balanced against the fact that it took a long time to prepare an Me-163B for flight. Unlike conventional combat aircraft used by the Luftwaffe, such as the Focke-Wulf 190 or the Me-109, you couldn't simply scramble an Me-163 to meet an oncoming threat. After the aircraft came to a stop, clearing it from the airfield was a major challenge, and a device was created to do that, the German name of which I won't even begin to try to pronounce. This device had airbags that were inflated under the wings of the aircraft, lifting it off the ground and enabling it to be removed from the field. It was later replaced by a device that used rigid arms instead of inflatable airbags. In these head-on shots of an Me-163B, there's a couple notable things here. First is the propeller at the very nose of the aircraft. This was used to drive a small electrical generator, which would be used to power instrumentation and radios on board the aircraft. Also visible in those shots, just above the well for the landing skid, was a small hole where a tow line could be attached. Most Me-163 flights of all members of the series were done in an unpowered mode, glide flights, generally using an Me-110 as a tow aircraft. Landing skid failures were fairly frequent with the Comet. The landing skid was hydraulically extended, and frequently that hydraulic system would fail. The next series of shots are going to give us some wonderful views of some of the interesting details on the Me-163B. Here, very noticeable is a flap, an undersurface wing flap that is partially extended. Note that those flaps fit onto the surface of the wing and are not recessed into the wing. Also notable here is the extended tail wheel. Note that this is a later Me-163B and that it has the fairing on the tail wheel. In just a moment, we're going to get some very good shots of the aft end of the aircraft. You can see here that smoke is still pouring from the nozzle of the Walter rocket engine. We mentioned earlier that the takeoff roll was especially difficult for ME-163 pilots. In addition to just the sheer length of the roll, directional stability was a problem during the early portion of the roll before the rudder became effective. A device called the straw rudder was tested on both the A and B models that would fit into the exhaust of the Walter rocket engine to give the pilot a bit of additional directional control during the early takeoff roll. Here we see the airbag version of the aircraft transporter in use. The next sequence of shots is especially fascinating because it gives us some glimpses of some of the more significant figures in the history of the ME-163. The woman in this photo is Hannah Reich. She was a prominent test pilot in Nazi Germany, a personal friend of Adolf Hitler, and she had campaigned heavily to be given the opportunity to fly the ME-163. The tall gentleman with sunglasses and a protective overcoat on is Heinrich Dittmar, who was one of the early test pilots very closely associated with the ME-163 program. We'll come back to the story of Hannah Reich in just a moment. Here we see some footage showing testing of a motor on an ME-163. A couple things are notable here. First, there's a protective cover that's been placed on the aft edge of the rudder. You can also see in several of these shots mock diamonds in the exhaust plume. That's indicative of the supersonic flow coming out of the engine. Here we have an ME-163B taking off from a paved runway. This would have been a much preferable experience for the pilots to a takeoff on an unimproved airfield. Another change that took place with the landing gear late in the program involved the landing gear. The early landing gear used on both the A and B models was rigid with no suspension. Not only were the takeoffs hard on the pilots, but they were hard on the aircraft as well. So eventually, shock absorbers were built into that takeoff gear to protect both the pilots and the aircraft itself. Here we have an ME-163B on tow behind an ME-110 tow aircraft. Most ME-163 testing and training occurred not under rocket power, but on towed flights. Let's move back to the story of Hannah Reich in the ME-163. Again, she had campaigned fairly aggressively to be given the opportunity to fly this aircraft, and she ended up flying the Comet a total of 5 times. On her final flight in the Comet, the takeoff gear failed to release just after takeoff, and she was forced to return to the field for a very hard landing. Her injuries were such that she was kept out of the cockpit for the next 5 months and never did fly the Comet again. The next series of films shows another individual who's very closely associated with the Comet program, Rudi Opitz. He, like Reich and Dittmar, was a very experienced glider pilot, and as such was especially valuable to the ME-163 program. Here we see him getting into an ME-163B. You'll note the machine gun protruding from the leading edge of the wing there. Also visible in many of these shots is the very thick piece of armored glass immediately in front of the pilot. Again, this was a combat aircraft at this point, and that piece of glass, along with an armored nose cone, was designed to protect the pilots as they flew straight at approaching Allied forces. In all likelihood, this is yet another test flight for the Comet. You'll note the very large data acquisition camera that Opitz has bolted to his head there in many of these shots. That's a spring-driven camera that the pilot can use to take photographs of the instrument panel during critical portions of the flight. It's certainly a far cry from the digital data acquisition equipment used on test aircraft today, and even a far cry from the crude analog systems used in the late 40s through the 50s and 60s.